The email arrived at midnight. 3 sentences. That was all it took to dismantle the life Ethan had carefully built for years. His contract was terminated, effective immediately. In a matter of weeks, everything unraveled. The steady paycheck disappeared. Bills began stacking up on the kitchen counter like silent accusations. The mortgage loomed, sleep vanished. And then came the final blow. The woman he loved quietly confessed she couldn't see a future anymore. Loss has a way of arriving all at once. That night, Ethan sat alone in the dim glow of his apartment, staring at the ceiling as if it might answer him. His chest felt heavy, his thoughts louder than the silence around him. He had always believed he was strong, dependable, capable, faithful. But strength feels different when the ground beneath you gives way. And in that fragile, breaking moment, a question rose from somewhere deeper than pride, deeper than fear. When I am at my weakest, where is God? It wasn't a polished prayer. It wasn't theological. It was raw, honest, desperate. Because sometimes faith doesn't shatter in a single dramatic moment. It erodes quietly under disappointment, under unanswered prayers, under silence. Ethan wasn't just losing a job. He was losing certainty, identity, control. And when everything that once defined you is stripped away, you are left with one terrifying possibility. What if weakness is not the end, but the place where something greater begins? Ethan grew up in a home where faith was not just discussed, it was lived. Sunday mornings meant church. Evenings sometimes ended with prayer around the dinner table. As a child, he memorized verses about God's faithfulness, about a father who would never abandon his children. He believed them with the simple, unshaken confidence only a child can have. I will never leave you nor forsake you. That promise felt solid back then, like bedrock beneath his feet. But adulthood has a way of testing what childhood once accepted without question. When hardship struck, when the job disappeared, when relationships fractured, when uncertainty replaced stability, those same promises began to feel strangely distant. Not untrue, just far away, like words spoken in another room. Ethan didn't stop believing in God overnight. It was subtler than that. The prayers became shorter, then less frequent, then replaced by distraction. Work, noise, routine, anything to avoid confronting the quiet ache inside. Until the night everything finally caught up with him. Alone in his apartment, with no strength left to pretend, he did something he hadn't done in years. He knelt beside his bed. There was no eloquent speech, no carefully formed sentences. He had once known how to pray with confidence, with structure, with gratitude. Now all he had were tears. They fell freely. Tears of exhaustion, confusion, and disappointment. "What happened?" he whispered. "Where are you?" He waited for comfort, for warmth, for some undeniable sense of presence. But the room remained silent, and in that silence, doubt felt louder than ever. Was God listening? Had he ever been? Or had Ethan simply believed what was easy when life was easy? Yet even in that fragile moment, kneeling, broken, unsure, there was something undeniable. He was still praying. And maybe, just maybe, the very act of reaching out in weakness was proof that faith, though shaken, was not gone. It was a gray, rain-soaked afternoon when Ethan found himself standing in front of his old church. He hadn't planned to come. In fact, he had spent months avoiding places that reminded him of the faith he felt he was losing. But that day, the door was slightly open, and something in him, maybe habit, maybe desperation, nudged him inside. The sanctuary was quiet. Raindrops tapped softly against stained glass windows, casting muted colors across the empty pews. The air carried a familiar scent of wood and candle wax. Ethan slipped into the back row, unsure of what he expected. He didn't pray. He didn't sing. He just sat there, heavy with questions. An elderly man with silver hair was slowly wiping down the benches near the front. He noticed Ethan and approached with a calm, knowing smile. Not intrusive, not judgmental, just present. "Been a while," the man said gently. Ethan nodded. After a moment, the words spilled out. "I don't think God hears me anymore." The old man didn't argue. He didn't preach. Instead, he asked, "Have you ever really read the story of Job?" Ethan shrugged. He remembered the basics. A good man who lost everything: wealth, family, health. It always sounded tragic, almost unbearable. The man sat down beside him and continued, "Most people focus on what Job lost, but that's not the heart of the story." He paused, letting the silence breathe. Job questioned. He grieved. He didn't understand. But through all of it, the ashes, the pain, the loneliness, God never left him. Not once. Ethan stared ahead, absorbing the words. The point wasn't that suffering wouldn't come. It wasn't that faith prevented loss. It was that loss did not equal abandonment. Sometimes, the old man explained softly, God doesn't stop the storm. Sometimes, he sits with you in it. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan wondered if silence didn't mean absence, but presence he had not yet recognized. That night, after leaving the church, Ethan didn't feel dramatically different. The bills were still there. The uncertainty hadn't vanished, but something small had shifted. Not around him, but within him. For the first time in years, he opened his Bible again. He didn't open it expecting lightning to strike or answers to fall perfectly into place. He wasn't searching for a miracle. He was searching for something quieter: presence, assurance, even the faintest reminder that he wasn't alone in his confusion. He began to read slowly, carefully, as if rediscovering words he had once known by heart. Some passages didn't immediately make sense. Others felt strangely personal, as though they had been waiting for this exact season of his life. And gradually, Ethan understood something he had never fully grasped before. Faith is not a feeling. Feelings rise and fall. They depend on circumstances, on outcomes, on whether life seems to be going your way. But faith, real faith, is a decision, a choice to trust even when nothing is visible, a commitment to believe even when emotions are unstable. He realized that much of his frustration came from expecting faith to feel strong all the time. But maybe strength wasn't loud. Maybe it was quiet persistence, continuing to show up, continuing to trust, even when clarity was absent. Slowly, his prayers began to change. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" a question that led only to frustration, he began asking, "What are you teaching me through this?" The shift was subtle, but powerful. The first question demanded explanation. The second invited growth. And in that new posture, Ethan discovered something surprising. Even before his circumstances improved, his heart was becoming steadier. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had chosen to trust the one who did. The change in Ethan didn't happen in isolation. As his heart slowly softened, he felt an unfamiliar urge, not to withdraw, but to step outward. One Saturday morning, he joined a small outreach group from the church. It wasn't glamorous work. No spotlight, no applause. Just folding tables, plastic containers, and simple meals prepared for people living on the streets. At first, Ethan felt awkward. Only weeks earlier, he had been the one drowning in anxiety over bills and uncertainty. Now he stood handing food to people who had lost far more: homes, stability, sometimes even family. Yet what struck him wasn't their loss. It was their gratitude. He made eye contact. He listened to stories. He saw faces he might once have hurried past without noticing. Then a middle-aged man stepped forward. His jacket was worn thin, his hands rough from years outdoors. Ethan handed him a meal and a bottle of water. The man paused, holding the container carefully, almost reverently. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I prayed this morning that God would send me something to eat." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He froze for a moment. That morning, this man had prayed, and somehow Ethan had been part of the answer. It wasn't dramatic, no thunder, no visible miracle, just a simple prayer and a simple act of obedience. And suddenly something clicked. God was not absent. God was moving, through ordinary people, through small acts of service, through hands willing to give. Ethan had been so focused on waiting for God to act in his own crisis that he hadn't noticed God was already at work all around him. In serving someone else's need, he began to see his own situation differently. Maybe faith wasn't only about receiving help. Maybe sometimes healing begins the moment you become the answer to someone else's prayer. About a month after that rainy afternoon in the church, Ethan's phone rang, with an unfamiliar sense of possibility. An old colleague had recommended him for a position at a small firm. The salary wasn't what he once earned. The title didn't sound impressive. The office wasn't glamorous. But when he hung up after the interview, there was something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. When the offer came, he accepted it with gratitude rather than pride. This time, it felt different. Before, his identity had been tightly wrapped around performance, income, and professional success. His confidence rose and fell with promotions, bonuses, and recognition. Losing his job had felt like losing himself, but the months of uncertainty had stripped something away, and in doing so, revealed something deeper. As he walked into his new workplace on the first day, Ethan realized he was no longer trying to prove his worth. He wasn't chasing validation. He wasn't measuring himself against others in the room. Somewhere along the way, he had learned a quiet but life-altering truth. His value did not begin with a paycheck, and it would not end with one. It was rooted in something far more secure: God's unconditional love. The struggles hadn't disappeared from his memory. The sleepless nights, the tears, the silence, they were still part of his story. But now he could see them differently. In his weakest season, when he felt exposed and incapable, something unexpected had happened. He had discovered dependence, and in that dependence, he experienced strength that wasn't his own. He finally understood what it meant that God's power is made perfect in weakness. Strength isn't the absence of struggle. It's trusting God in the middle of it. And as Ethan stepped into his new beginning, he knew this: the hardest chapter of his life hadn't destroyed him. It had refined him. There are seasons in life when silence feels overwhelming, when prayers seem to rise no higher than the ceiling, when you look around and see no clear direction, no immediate rescue, no obvious sign that anyone, even God, is listening. In those moments, it's easy to assume absence. It's easy to interpret delay as neglect, silence as indifference, hardship as abandonment. When we feel alone, lost, and unheard, our emotions can become the loudest voice in the room. And that voice often whispers the same lie: you're on your own. But this story tells us something different. Feeling alone is not the same as being alone. Faith is not the certainty that everything will work out quickly. It is not constant emotional reassurance. Faith is the quiet conviction that even when you cannot see the path, you are not walking it by yourself. Sometimes we only recognize God's presence in hindsight. We look back and realize that the strength we had shouldn't have been enough. The door that opened came at the right time. The lesson learned shaped us in ways comfort never could. Rock bottom has a strange clarity to it. When everything else is stripped away, pride, control, self-sufficiency, we are left face to face with our need. And in that vulnerable space, something shifts. We finally look up, not because we have all the answers, but because we know we cannot carry the weight alone anymore.